In high school, which for me was in the early 80s, graduated from high school in 1985. During that time, I wasn't a particularly good science student. In fact, I would go so far as to say I was a terrible science student. I think I got a series of D's in chemistry. Did okay in physics, but certainly not more than a B minus. But I was absolutely captivated by the Carl Sagan TV series Cosmos, which was being broadcast at the time. The television series, and there was an accompanying book that ignited some part of me. Not the part that, can you hear that? I love the sound of leaf blowers. I really do. I wrote a piece for leaf blower engines once. I'll see if I can dig out the realization of it. It had 3 different engines that obviously had different pitches. I think they're quite melodic. So I hope you can hear that. Where was I? Carl Sagan, Cosmos, ignited some part of my imagination that still is present in my work, my interests, my artistic, my creative, my writing work. And I think that this is as Sagan intended. Right? We are human to the extent that we understand our place in the cosmos. And we are ennobled we are made noble. We are noblified by the degree to which we understand our position in the cosmos. The last couple of videos I've talked about our experience of the moment as relative to the singularity at the beginning of the universe, or relative to the singularity that is a black hole. I can say these things because I have enough science language, even though I'm not a scientist. I don't work in a lab, I don't work in a radio telescope, I don't have any discipline or background, but I have been enriched by the expression of this scientific understanding by people like Carl Sagan, people who are as much a poet and a storyteller as they are scientists. So we all have this rich tradition of understanding the cosmos. And for me, in that very influential period of time, in the early 80s, Carl Sagan meant a lot and said a lot, spoke a lot to me. So along with that then, I became interested in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, which at the time was a NASA program. This was the early 80s. So it took Ronald Reagan a few years to figure out that NASA shouldn't spend money on aliens and whatnot, and so the program was canceled. It was before the Contact movie, which is the fiction account, sort of anticipating what it would be to receive an alien artifact on Earth written by Carl Sagan, and derived from the Drake equation, which takes the variables that at the time we thought were necessary to understand the likelihood of intelligent life in the universe. So it started with things like, how many habitable planets do we think there might be? Things like, how long does it take to evolve certain kinds of metabolic creatures? How long does it take to understand certain types of science and technology? You know, these attributes, these variables, these vectors were weighted and assigned, and then there was the Drake equation that came up with a pretty low number around the likelihood of encountering extraterrestrial intelligence. The Drake equation sort of lines up with Fermi's paradox. I've written in some places, and I'll come back with a video, that Fermi's paradox is not a paradox, it's a conundrum. It's Fermi's conundrum. And the terms of the conundrum are fixed in the sense of a weighted dice or a roulette table in a for the bank, weighted for the bank. But I promise I'll come back to that in a different video. The point I want to talk about today then is we have the search for extraterrestrial intelligence based on assumptions about viability of habitation and what intelligence might look like, right? And when we consider the mechanism of the search, we're looking at radio frequencies, which I still think is useful, but it's getting louder, isn't it, that leaf blower? I'm going to keep it because, again, I like it. It's a nice counterpoint. I'll dig up my leaf blower pieces. So we defined intelligence, the evidence of intelligence, primarily, first and foremost, by the evidence of radio frequencies. And that's fair enough, right? But it's a bit short-sighted. Yeah? We assume that alien intelligence will represent our highest understanding of intelligence. You know, back in the 15th century, there were proposals to dig great big ditches in Transylvania, the Black Forest or somewhere, fill those ditches with tar and light them on fire. And because the ditches would be carved in the shape of the Pythagorean solids, we assumed that our intelligent compatriots on Mars would see these and know that we, here on Earth, were intelligent, because geometry was the highest form of intelligence that we could envision. So radio is great, but radio is a marker for us, because we're already today silent as far as radio. Everything is digital. So if an alien intelligence were doing what we're doing, scanning the skies, they would see, beginning in 1936 with the Olympic broadcast, they would see, this is what happens in contact. They send that back to us as evidence that we've been identified. But then by like the early 2000s, and certainly by now, I'm recording this in 2023, most of our communication is digital. We aren't sending out anywhere near the volume of radio waves that we were even 10, 15 years ago. That doesn't mean we're not intelligent, although you could make a case for it. Search for extraterrestrial intelligence. All of that is the most fascinating question that I can think of, except for messaging for extraterrestrial intelligence. So instead of SETI, we have METI. And I was fortunate enough a while back to get involved with the METI organization and give a couple of presentations at some of their workshops, and get involved a little bit in some of the discussions. The first paper I presented, which was way back 20 years ago now, was on the idea of using music as a sort of constructive guide for creating a message that could go outbound, broadcast in a radio. It's still thinking in that context. And by music, I didn't mean and don't mean Bach or sending a piece of music that has been written on a record, which we did with Voyager. It's a fantastic piece, fantastic. Like the Voyager disc is a work of art itself. And encodes complexity. As such, it is a fantastic message. But I wasn't thinking of broadcasting like a radio station out to Andromeda. I was thinking instead of applying very generic ideas of creativity in music. So the manipulation of the vectors of sound, amplitude, frequency, with the radio telescope acting more as an instrument. So what are the characteristics of a radio telescope? Well, they're quite narrowly defined in terms of where they broadcast and what the capabilities are of shifting frequency within a single telescope, right? The idea of like a theremin can play a slide across a very wide range of octaves. That doesn't really exist in a telescope. My understanding is that a telescope can basically broadcast on one of two frequencies determined by the telescope. So it's more like a drone. So what are the characteristics of a drone that you can manipulate? So as you broadcast it, some entity would pick that up and would identify it as non-natural, that there was some design behind it. It's a fascinating question, the idea of a radio telescope as a musical instrument, not just as a broadcast tool, but as an instrument itself. And how would you be a virtuoso of the radio telescope? Messaging to extraterrestrial intelligence. But, recently, as I've listened more about artificial intelligence, it's very clear that we can have general intelligence without even having to get into the question of consciousness. So how would we message to an extraterrestrial consciousness? How would we receive extraterrestrial consciousness? It would be in a form that is literally alien, possessed of no recognizable attributes. How do you communicate? How do you even identify that there's a message when that message is likely to come in a format that is unlike anything that we've ever experienced before? It requires us to shift our consciousness first in order for us to approach the cosmos and the consciousness within that cosmos without our existing filters. Aliens don't have big ears that pick up radios. They don't have eyes that scan ultraviolet lasers. The sensorium of an alien is beyond our imagination. The scale of an alien is beyond our imagination. I would challenge the idea of a habitable planet being a necessary definition, because who's to say where consciousness resides? We assume that it resides within our metabolism because there is definitely a connection, as I talked about in the last video, between our sort of onboarded consciousness and our metabolic focus and construct. But I don't recognize that to be a priori necessity for the existence of either intelligence or consciousness. Certainly for intelligence, we recognize that there's no requirement that it be metabolic, that it be carbon-based, that it have the attributes of what we call life. And for consciousness, the link is even more tenuous, or even less tenuous and more broad. I mean, there's no way to tell. So when we talk about METC, messaging for extraterrestrial communication, I think we have to start thinking liturgically. We have to start thinking about work that we do that opens our perception first, whether that is a cathedral where the human voice echoes for time beyond which our voice could naturally be sustained, whether it is the digital capability in my Mac OS sampling application where I can parse sound down to a millisecond, a time scale that is far beyond the immediate perception of my ears in terms of in terms of duration or size. Consciousness in the cosmic level, we think of consciousness associated with a body that lives for 75 years, is roughly 6 feet, heart beats once every second or so. We think in these scales. I think for the messaging with extraterrestrial consciousness, we need art and science that extends beyond those vectors of our own imagining. So what do you think? Drop a note in my email or a comment, subscribe, pass along, correct and comment on what I've said. It's always a delight to hear from people. So please, keep your wits about you.